Welcome to our 7th iteration of our podcast. C is for Columbia, the podcast where we talk about life, the world, politics, and whatever else we have on our minds. Sam, what's our first topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So first podcast of the new year, I believe.
That's true.
2023 is upon us now. Should be pretty interesting. You know, by the end of this year, the primaries will kind of start to technically start, or at least the debates. So pretty exciting time. So basically, the first thing that I want to bring up is Kevin McCarthy is now the Speaker of the House for Congress, Republican from California. And so it was a bit of an adventure to go ahead and get him nominated. I believe they tried like at least a dozen times to get the votes in, and a lot of these people did not want to budge. They did not want him to be the Speaker of the House. This kind of happened back in 2015. He was originally going to be the Speaker back in 2015, and there wasn't enough support, so they got Paul Ryan to go ahead and be the Speaker of the House. Paul Ryan, of course, isn't really involved in politics anymore. So Kevin McCarthy did eventually get nominated. There were a lot of compromises made. It's interesting because Donald Trump was supportive of him being Speaker, but a lot of his loyal followers were not that supportive. Matt Gaetz, for instance, was very much against his nomination. And the Trump wing of the party does not control the Republican branch of Congress at this point. They did get kind of a more stereotypical, I'd say like neoconservative, neoliberal Republican as the House Speaker. But I guess what I would want to bring up is given how hard it was just to get him nominated, how effective of a Speaker of the House is he going to be? The Republicans have a rather slim majority in Congress right now, and the party itself is very divided. I'm thinking this could be a very ineffective speakership. I don't think he has a lot of support from a lot of Republicans. And you just have to wonder, what is Congress going to look like going into this year and 2024? You see a lot of division still, as we've been talking about, within the Republican Party. And you have a very weak speaker who I don't think really wields a lot of power right now, even within his party. And then on top of that, you do have a slim majority. So I think that's going to be very interesting. I'm really interested to see what they try to pass. Obviously, Republicans do not have a majority in the Senate. So even what they do pass can be shot down by both the Senate and Joe Biden. But at the end of the day, he did get appointed. He did win his election within the House after, I think, over a dozen tries. And, it'll be interesting. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, what he's really able to do. I'm not really sure what his agenda is. In his acceptance speech, he did talk about, the source of COVID, which I kind of feel like is something he threw out there to appease his base and, other issues in that genre.
Okay.
But what does, in your opinion, a speakership for Kevin McCarthy look like for the rest of his term?
All right, yeah, regarding McCarthy, I think it took 15 vote attempts to get him in. I'm not sure if I think it was mostly due to concessions that McCarthy was being denied by the right wing of his party. He eventually made enough concessions that he got enough votes to assume the speaker. So as far as his effectiveness as speaker, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the rules have changed for how to call a vote to remove a speaker. Am I wrong about that, or do you know anything about that?
I'm under the impression there was a rule change. I don't know the specifics.
There was. The rule change has now left it so that it only takes, I believe, 6 House representatives to call for a vote to remove the speaker. Of course, this could really slow down any progress made in the House. If they want to continue to attack McCarthy, if the right wing wants to, they can continually bring up votes to try to remove him. And if of course those votes pass, he will be removed. But rather, that just hangs over the House, almost used as a filibuster, in a sense. It could be used as a filibuster to try to filibust the, as you, I believe, said, the traditional conservative Republican agenda in order to block any action happening in the House. Now, regarding, though, him as Speaker, let's assume that he's not removed. There, like you said, there is a Democratic Senate and a Democratic administration. So I don't think that the Republicans are necessarily looking to get much through in their own agenda's sense. Things that would normally pass will still probably pass, but a lot of the agenda-driven stuff will probably be brought up and killed as a bill. So I think that actually that might be an opportunity for that right wing to try to at least pontificate and move some legislation around in a way to get buzz surrounding their issues, whatever those might be. And actually, that could be an opportunity for them, I think. There aren't too many consequences to them bringing up let's call it radical legislation, knowing that it wouldn't pass, So yeah, a weak Speaker, a weak McCarthy, I don't necessarily see as a bad thing for the Republicans, simply because they don't really have a chance to push anything through. And having a weak Speaker or a more conservative Speaker, they could actually use him a bit as a pawn. So we'll see how that plays out, though.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'll add to that, I mean, the Republican majority in Congress was always basically at this point just going to serve to obstruct the Democrats and Joe Biden from really passing any meaningful policies. And their hope is for the next 2 years, Biden is essentially a lame duck president, and then somebody in the Republican Party replaces him, although none of that's a guarantee and probably pointless to speculate about. This early on in 2023, but I think Congress is going to be pretty pointless for the next 2 years,
Yep,
based on.
As happens, I guess, as that does happen.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just want to bring that up since it was pretty recent. A couple of other things. So, I have an interesting story. So, the state of New York passed a bill legalizing what's known as human composting. So the Democratic governor signed legislation not that long ago to legalize natural organic reduction, popularly known as human composting, making New York the sixth state in the union to allow that method of burial. Washington State became the first state to legalize human composting back in 2019, followed by Oregon and Oregon and Colorado in 2021, and Vermont and California in 2022. Ted, when you die, what do you want to happen with your body? Do you want to be human composted and become a tree?
That's a great question. I know that personally, my mother has really thought about this a lot, and she has wondered, does she want to get cremated? There's also these services that will turn you into coral or turn your ash into some carbon nutrient that could be fed to trees. So human composting sounds along those lines, like you're going to be turned into nutrients for animals or plants or
Right.
something like that. And that would be very attractive to my mom. For me personally, I wouldn't be against that. As far as I'm personally concerned, after I'm dead, I don't really care what happens to my body. And regardless, I think that burying someone in the dirt, that's really, really ineffective human composting, because the body will break down and turn back into nutrients. It's just, are we going to speed it up and actually make it so that within a few years after that person is deceased, their body is useful. My mom's also talked about donating her body to science in various forms, as cadavers or whatever. I don't personally see any issue with human composting. Interesting that New York is the sixth state to legalize it. I don't really know the arguments against it.
I don't either. I think some people are just kind of traditional when it comes to stuff like that. They want the open casket burial. I guess I don't really see most people. I haven't been to like that many funerals. I have seen some cremations. I have seen one open casket type of funeral. Truthfully, I don't have any kids. It doesn't look like I'm going to have any nieces or nephews, so I'm not really sure who would actually be at my funeral, so I just don't know.
I'll come to your funeral.
Oh, well, thank you. Um, well, it's just going to be just you carrying the casket then if I don't get human composted. So I don't, I hadn't really thought about it before, but I thought it was just kind of an interesting type of law that got
As
passed.
far as you mentioned an open casket and having an open funeral, well, those things are still legal. So, and you can still have an open casket. You can really choose how to do that. Interestingly, human bodies are not the property of anyone. The next of kin do not own the remains of a human body. So, I imagine that there's a lot of legislative and probably political clout surrounding funerals and the funeral business and the funeral industry. So there might be some lobbying firms that are really pushing against that for whatever reason. They don't feel like they can monetize it. They feel like it might hurt their industry.
That's true. Yeah.
That's a possibility because I know that the funeral industry is rather it's big
Yeah.
and it's probably quite powerful. So that might be a factor in legalizing this human composting idea and waiting for those funeral homes to be able to jump on that and be able to compost themselves. But as far as that goes, I could kind of understand why there's probably some legislative. It's kind of like moving through molasses in that if industry hasn't caught up to being able to utilize that, there's going to be a lot of pushback against legalizing it because that might undercut their business or undercut that industry, which you can argue that's a bad reason to pass laws and all that, but it is still a factor in that's strongly in play when it comes to politics in general.
One thing I didn't mention last time we had a podcast, and we are a bit late on this, but this has been a story in terms of Elon Musk, and how he's handled Twitter. Um, he's been kind of unpopular. So, like, when this first started out, I feel like the worry was that, he was going to give, like, the alternative right more of a platform on Twitter. Donald Trump hasn't really used it much since it's come back. But, it seems to be interesting here. His investors are really sick of him, working on Twitter. I think, Elon Musk was somebody who, was a very successful businessman, really good at building cars. And I think there's kind of a push from his investors now saying, like, look, this is killing our stocks. You need to focus on what you're good at this point, and this just isn't it. It's unclear to me why Elon Musk wanted to own Twitter in the first place. It seems like he almost backed out of it, but would have lost a bunch of money at one point of time. I'm not a huge social media person. I've never really used Twitter, so I'm not the most knowledgeable on, social media kind of subjects. But I mean, this is a website that's had a lot of traffic for a very long time. It's something that's referenced in news stories now. I mean, is Twitter dead? Is this pretty much the end of Twitter? Are we going to move on from Twitter and maybe replace it with another social media outlet? And should we even really be using these social media websites so much in the
Well,
first place?
to answer that question, as far as my opinion on whether Twitter is dead, I do not think that Twitter is dead. The reason being is that it is still the go-to place for celebrities, journalists, and other public figures to make these contextless blurbs, contextless information exchange that can be proliferated very quickly and very broadly. A lot of what happens on Twitter is covered by mainstream media outlets still, especially if it's a large public figure that is making tweets And the nice thing about Twitter for public figures is that in the past, when you would make a speech, you could take a soundbite from that speech, and that is what would get played on the large media platforms. That's what people would hear. Sound bites, decontextualized. On Twitter, everything is decontextualized automatically, being that it is just however many characters. People can put whatever they want on, and it gets pushed off into that platform. And what makes that nice is that you can't be taken out of context because the blurb is already out of context. The tweet is the tweet. So I don't think that Twitter, I suppose that people could exit Twitter, but that would take a lot of momentum. Because where are they going to go? There are other platforms like Twitter that copy Twitter's MO. However, they are usually pretty niche, and they have very niche-y user bases. And the nichiness of, say, Parler or Truth Social is going to push a lot of people off of jumping onto those platforms and starting to use those platforms outside of their niche. So to answer your question, I do not think it's the end of Twitter. It might be the end of Twitter's ability to monetize, and they were never very good at monetizing in the first place. Compare them to Facebook or YouTube or Google. Twitter was always kind of the underdog when it came to monetization of content. They really never got that, but what they were was able to be covered by larger ABC, NBC, larger news networks that were covering news, and that's how they could proliferate content. It wasn't monetizable, but that's how they would get into the public eye the easiest. I never really spent much time on Twitter, but I always heard about this or that person tweeted this or that. And so I think that's a key in whether Twitter will die or not, is whether the mainstream media start or stop covering Twitter, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So that's as far as whether I think Twitter or not will die or not. As far as Elon Musk goes, he, as far as I can tell, his purchase of Twitter, he is now basically an oligarch, an American oligarch. He has bought it outright. He doesn't really need to care about shareholders, as he is now the controlling owner of the company. He now controls the company in a hostile takeover. He has bought it. You mentioned whether he didn't or did want to, and I think that perhaps he was trying to back out, but they would not let him after making that public call to purchase it and making moves to purchase it. After that credit was allocated, a lot of interests were not going to let him back down from that, because that would kill their stock price, of course. If Elon Musk, suddenly he was looking to buy it, and then he learned, I'm not going to buy it, and that would tank their stock price, which would hurt their shareholders and hurt their investors. But now he's bought it. I kind of see it as this is the multi-billionaire version of buying a yacht. What do you do with a yacht? Are you looking to make money on a yacht? Probably not. You're looking to enjoy it, and you're looking to use it as a vessel of your own will. So how do you want to explore the world in the case of a yacht? But on Twitter, how does he want to reshape it and rebuild it how he sees fit in order to promote whatever it is he wants to promote, whether that's right-wing ideology, it could be left-wing ideology, it could be no ideology. He might just want to experiment around and try things. That's what I think happened with that whole $8 concept. He was trying to see if people would be willing to pay for a premium service, like any other premium service or streaming service or whatever. People would be willing to pay for that in order to unlock certain features. That might bring revenue into the company. It's an experiment, and I think that he's experimenting a lot with it, which he has the ability to do, as it is his yacht. It is his company now. So as far as upsetting investors, I don't really think that concerns him. I don't think he really cares. Um, and yeah, that about covers my thoughts on Twitter. Do you have any thoughts on that?
To be honest, I just think all social media is toxic, and I think we'd be better off not spending too much time on it. But it is a news story.
Well, I don't
It
disagree.
is a news story, and I thought we should pull it up. A few other things I had on my mind. So something happened recently. There's a Huffington Post article about this. Americans can now carry a gun without a license in 25 American states. Alabama recently just implemented a law allowing for carrying a gun without a permit. 13 years ago, only Vermont and Alaska allowed unlicensed carry. Study shows there was actually a spike in gun sales during COVID recently. So I guess my question is why is America so passionate about guns? And what does that mean for society? Our European neighbors kind of look down on us for this, I think, to a certain extent. Um, I'm not like super pro gun control. I am in favor of some measures of gun control, especially with semi automatics. Just on a personal view, I don't own a gun, and I've never really held a gun or used a gun beyond a BB gun when I was a kid. But we are at the point where 50% of American states, have this policy. So yeah, I guess just like why is America so passionate about guns at its core, and what like implications does that have overall?
Well, certainly the culture surrounding guns in America is very strong, and that arguably that goes back to uh, the founding of um, the Americas. How there was no national military; it was a bunch of
Right.
militias that had firearms, and they were using these firearms in order to break away from an empire. That was probably key in establishing firearms as a culture in the Americas. Of course, hey, times do change. The technology surrounding guns has exponentially increased since then. Um, so there are arguments to be made that perhaps there are, and we do have restrictions on certain weapons that are not allowed. Um, Fully automatics, things of that nature, extremely high caliber rifles, things of that nature. But that culture surrounding guns, of course, makes it um, a political namesake in the country. Advocates of staunch Second Amendment defense are going to be advocated for in some circles simply because it is written in the Constitution, in the Second Amendment, that there shall not be. I don't remember the exact language, so I don't want to misquote, but it is a rather explicit allowance. But you mentioned the whole states have removed the necessity of having a permit to carry a weapon. I don't necessarily see that as a threat. It's more of a rhetorical threat, if anything, because what it does is it just tries to get conversation around guns to get talked about again. Because removing the permit, people that would commit they've already purchased the weapon. Whether they can carry it or not legally comes down to whether if they're going to commit a crime with the weapon, they're going to carry the weapon anyway. They've already purchased the weapon. Removing the necessity of a permit, simply, it sounds to me as though it's simply a way to try to move the needle on gun reform and gun legislation, or to signal, hey, I'm pro, the legislation is pro-gun, or the legislation wants to expand rights to firearms, that sort of thing. So that seems more like a signal to me than anything. I don't see removing the permit as a threat. Do you?
Well, and this is kind of the thing. Like, while I'm certainly not a gun nut, I also am on the belief that prohibitions generally don't work. And you have a point. If somebody was going to commit a crime with a gun, putting a permit on having a gun wouldn't really prevent them. from committing that crime. And I do think some of this is symbolic. I do think
Sure.
the gun issue is one of those issues for Republicans they use to like rile up the base. It's kind of like how we talked about pro-life a
Yeah.
few podcasts ago about it. This is just one of
Yeah.
those,
Yeah.
yeah, like one of those like, red meat issues that they kind of like to call them. What I would say is this: I think some of this is cultural, like you said. Like,
Yeah.
we have the Second Amendment. We had, this loose group of militias when the country was first founded. But I also think the gun lobby plays a pretty big role in this. Like, some of this is just the gun lobby wanting to make more money, and they kind of,
Sure.
feed this rhetoric
Absolutely.
about how, like,
Yep.
the government is trying to take away your guns. Obama wanted to take away your guns. Biden wanted to. And this really just comes from, like, businessmen and lobbyists in the gun industry wanting to make more money, essentially. And, I mean, capitalism does play a role in that. As for the change of law itself, I mean, it's something that's going to upset a lot of more anti gun liberal types. In terms of what this will actually do, in terms of affecting our day to day life, I don't think it's going to be huge personally. But it is very interesting, like how this has, and that's kind of why I bring up the gun lobby, because originally it was just Vermont and Alaska, so Bernie Sanders' state and Sarah Palin's state, that allowed this, and how it's half of the states, and I feel like most of the states probably do lean more conservative. But I guess what I would say is it's just kind of a combination of, it's gun lobbyists, people who just, want to make more money for the gun industry. And then to a certain extent, it is just sort of red meat for the Republicans. Like, they don't really know what they're going to do with this.
That is
But
true. They just want to move the needle. Yeah.
yeah, it's just this rhetoric that fires up the base. I mean, there are a lot of people who vote Republican, and one of the main issues, if not the issue, really is just gun control.
Yep. Single issue voters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was about to say single issue voters. And it is kind of interesting though. We are at the point where half of the states have passed this law, because of course gun control has been one of the more contentious issues, probably even especially just in the last decade. I think the debates on this have heated up quite a bit.
Yeah, I do question, because this is totally about permits for carrying, right? Concealed carry permits being.
That was my understanding.
Okay.
Yes.
So that doesn't do anything regarding purchasing. So people could purchase however many or whatever legal weapons there are, purchasing them. The rules haven't changed. The only rule that's really changed is whether you can carry or not. That might lead someone to say, well, now that I don't need a permit, I'll go buy a handgun to carry to protect myself. Is that a likely field of thought? I don't really even think that is a likely path of thought, because what you would do is say, I want to protect myself. I'll buy the firearm, I'll buy the handgun, and then I'll go get a permit. If I wanted to protect myself, I'll get the permit. Removing the permit does remove one barrier of entry, I suppose, but it doesn't change anything about whether a felon can purchase a weapon legally. I assume that felons couldn't get a concealed carry permit in most states, and removing this bar of entry doesn't change much about that. They still can't purchase the weapon if they couldn't, and the rules are still in place such that whoever can't buy a gun can't buy a gun, and whoever can. That doesn't change much. So I really do think that's mostly a signal. And like you mentioned, the gun lobby might have been pushing for this to try to expand. Maybe more people would buy a weapon if there wasn't a concealed carry permit law. I'm not so sure that's the case, though. I think I see it much more as a signal that, yeah, the special interests surrounding the gun lobbies have control of a particular legislative body to pass this law. I assume it was a law that was passed. This was not an administrative move by the state.
My understanding is it was a law. If I can just go back to my notes real quick. Yeah, here's the direct quote. Alabama recently just implemented a law for allowing carrying a gun without a permit. So this would have been something that was voted on rather than like a state
Okay.
court type of thing.
Yeah. So if it were a law that was passed, I see it mostly as a signal of where the legislative body stands, and not really anything that'll substantively change anything. But on the note of guns, did you hear about the 6-year-old
Yeah,
that committed a school shooting? That's mental. I just couldn't believe that.
that is mental. I mean, God, I am really glad I'm not in a public school right now.
I'm sure that there'll be, clearly he got access to the weapons somehow. Probably through gross negligence of the parents, I assume.
Yeah,
That'll
I
all
mean, I
come
was
out.
about to say
Yeah.
he had some hick dad that just had guns lying around and not like in a secure case where they probably should be, or at least
Yeah,
hidden somewhere.
there was clearly some lacking of security surrounding the firearm.
Yeah,
In order for a 6-year-old to get
but
it.
God, I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, a 6-year-old kid. Like, what grade are you in when you're like six? Like kindergarten,
First
first
grade. I think it
grade?
was in
I
first
think like
grade.
yeah,
Yeah.
6 to 7 is first grade. So it was either like towards the end of kindergarten or beginning of first. I guess given
Hmm.
when it happened, like in terms of what year it was, probably the beginning of first grade, I would assume. But not that it's like that important.
Yeah.
But I mean that's still. I mean, God, when I was in the first grade, I was like playing with
Well, yeah.
Legos with my dad.
Well,
I
just
mean, I
imagine
wasn't.
his classmates, the parents of his classmates, are going to have to talk to their kids about this, and like, are they gonna allow their kid now to even play guns, like pretend guns or anything like that?
Oh yeah, even that compared to when we were kids. Like when I was a kid, we'd like on recess, we'd find like sticks that were kind of like shaped like a gun and like
Oh, sure.
pretend
Yeah.
to like, fight each other. Like these days you can't. I read a story once like a long time ago. I don't have like a source for it, but you'll just have to take my word for it, I guess. Some kid
Sure.
at lunch bit into a Pop Tart to make the Pop Tart look like the shape of
I heard
a
about
gun.
that.
You
I
remember
remember
this too,
that.
and he
Yep.
got in like a bunch of trouble. And it's just like, I mean,
Yes, he
yeah,
did.
everything's so different now. The Generation Z, Generation Alpha, what they're experiencing. I mean, it's weird. You think back at history. I mean, the big one was Columbine, and we were both fairly young when Columbine.
I don't even remember
Like,
Columbine.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't
I don't
remember
really
it.
remember it happening. I was probably this was 99, so we were probably about the same age
Yeah,
as that
I
kid
was.
we were just talking about basically. Like, yeah,
Yeah, I was
I wasn't
6.
really
I was
watching the
6. Yeah.
news, and that was sort of seen as this freak accident that would never happen again. And then it just became this thing where it's just like schools aren't like people don't really feel safe sending their kids to schools. People want to homeschool and all of these
Oh, that's interesting.
things.
So I wonder what the data on that is. Is there any data? I guess you wouldn't have it available, but data that is showing anxiety pushing um, parents to pull their kids out of schools based on that fear.
I'm just basing this based on like things some of my older friends have said. I knew somebody in Washington who pulled her kids
Oh,
out of
interesting.
school because she was worried. So this isn't really like scientific data, it's just like word of mouth in terms
Okay.
of what I've experienced as someone who has friends that have kids these days and kind of anxiety regarding that. But I don't know if there's really, some people get kind of mad when you make it like a mental health issue rather than a gun safety issue. And my point is,
That
I
comes
don't
down to
see why it
politics.
can't be
Yeah,
like a little bit of both. Like maybe we could, you know,
I agree. I agree.
make it so, like at the very least, like background checks, I guess, or like a mental health evaluation. I don't have like a specific policy to propose, but maybe
Hmm.
there's like things we could do to keep guns out of the hands of people who are like clearly not mentally stable. It is kind of interesting. Here's the comparison I've always kind of made. You go to an airport, there's so much security when you go on an airport. There's so many little things you can't bring with you on an airplane. But we haven't really had a major terrorist attack on an airplane in America since 9/11. But when it comes to public schools, this feels like it happens all the time, but there doesn't really seem to be as much of a push to, prevent this from happening the same way we did with, terrorist attacks. And it's just kind of interesting to me because, the Republican Party used to kind of be the party of like national security. But why aren't we treating these school shooters and these movie theater shooters as terrorists and kind of taking it as, a terrorist threat? The same way we did with, Al Qaeda and the Taliban, in the early 2000s, I guess.
Yeah, there seems to be a difficulty with what is known as quote unquote common sense gun legislation. Um, that term is thrown around a lot for things like a waiting period for purchasing a firearm, or things like that, or background checks. I think that the worry among special interests, and that would be specifically gun lobbies, is that, well, the gun lobby is set up in order to protect a specific industry and to let that industry continue to build and thrive. If concessions are made, even those that are called common sense, those concessions can then signal to those interests that, well, more concessions will be made, or you're pulling away from us. Why are you pulling away from us? Especially if the environment's really hostile, which it's arguable that guns could be considered a very hostile issue in America. People have strong opinions regarding them, things like that. Politicians speak very strongly one way or the other on the issue. There seem to be some areas of compromising between guns and mental health, or whatever, what have you. But one of the reasons, at least I think, that that room for compromise is evaporated is because of the strong worry on perhaps both sides that any concession one way will lead to an ultimate takeover, because the balance of power is so fine, it hangs on a razor blade. So I think that actually probably prevents a lot of the standard quote unquote common sense stuff from getting through. And that's why you see, school shooting after school shooting after school shooting, or shooting after shooting. Let's not even say schools. It's just shooting after shooting. You'll see those, and nothing will be done because either side is very worried about making concessions on those issues, because of an event or what have you. So 9/11's a bit different, of course. 9/11 was a foreign act, or at least it was framed as a foreign act. So there was a lot of push then we can restrict the freedoms of foreigners, who cares? And, that sounds mean, but we can go ahead and do that. We, of course, did restrict some of our own freedoms in flight, surveillance, those sorts of things. At the time, there seemed to be a huge wave of support to do those things because of the shock of 9/11. And I think that school shootings, or shootings in general, are just not shocking. They simply don't have a shock value. They're something to look at, and the news will cover them, but they don't have the same shock value as something like 9/11. Columbine was probably very shocking, because Columbine was, again, one of the first. But once it's happened 30, 40, 50 times, it's just not going to have the same shock value.
Well, and the other thing is what they try to do now, because there's two ways you can go about this. Some people kind of have the mindset of more coverage means this won't happen again. But the thing is, if we didn't give these people, we almost kind of give these criminals a celebrity status, which I think they kind of
sometimes
crave, sort of. We should still cover the story, but maybe don't show the face of the shooter, and kind of send a message that you're not going to be a celebrity when you do this. You're just going to be seen as a piece of shit.
Yeah, your name will not be remembered,
and you'll be discarded from society. Because I think that is some of their motivation.
Right.
They want to be looked at as a legend to edgy high school kids or something like that. And it's just, we may want to go changed the way we cover these stories. But just the thing is, for cable news, it's just such a way for them to get attention and to get people to watch, their crappy program like
Yep.
CNN or something. Um, that
Yep.
I mean, it's the same way. If we, I hate bringing like this up, but I mean, it's the same mindset. If we just hadn't covered Trump, Trump would have probably never been elected. If we didn't sensationalize
Sure, he got tons
if
of
we
free
didn't
press. Yeah.
sensationalize so much in the corporate media, then maybe we'd see different results. But the thing is, all these media outlets, I mean, they are businesses and they do want to make money and they just care about getting
Right.
viewers. News wasn't originally like this in America. News was a lot more, nonpartisan. It was just about presenting important stories, and it just wasn't sexy and exciting enough. So they turned it into this
Well, I
bullshit
yeah.
industry.
I was gonna say that I think that the news of old, for one, came out of a lot less competition. There were not as many news. Let's talk like 1700s. I mean, printing press, spreading the printing press around America to get pamphlets out. That has a lot less competition, that media consumption, than the radio did, and that cable news and now the internet has done, because those technologies have expanded the ability to spread that consumption, to spread the consumption of news, media, what have you. Prior to these technologies around, what was important was decided by a pretty small handful of people that would decide what would we put out, what would people be interested in reading, that sort of thing. After that, corporatism grew up, though. Deciding what people want to see becomes a game of what do we want them to see, in a way. How could we game their consumption of news? How can we game the public's consumption of news? And yes, part of that was then we could sensationalize the name of the shooter. But actually, I've seen some pushback on this recently, because after Sandy Hook, where the shooter there was well covered, his name was Adam Lanza. I see a lot less the names of the shooters being covered. For instance, I knew Adam Lanza. You probably know the name of the Columbine shooters, do you?
Harold, I think, and some other
Nah,
guy.
Dylan Klebold.
Dylan, that's right.
Yep. Yeah, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. Those are the two Columbine shooters. But do you remember the Vegas shooter?
To be honest, not off the top of my head.
Yeah, the Vegas shooter, I don't really think he became too famous. He was an older guy from Florida. That's all I remember. And then how about Uvalde? Uvalde happened
Yeah, no,
last
I
year.
see your point, and I mean it's absolutely.
I'm sure some people can remember the name of the Uvalde shooter. I believe it was. See, I can't even remember. It was an ethnic name, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. So I think they're covering it a lot less because people are aware that we don't want to make these people celebrities.
Right, and I think that's
Um,
the way to go. Because I mean that's what happened
yeah,
with the Columbine people. Like, I mean, maybe celebrity isn't the right word, but I mean, like for that period of time, like everybody knew who they were, and there's all these like documentaries about them.
yeah.
Michael Moore made actually kind of an interesting documentary, in my opinion, called
Bowling. Are you
Bowling.
talking about Bowling for Columbine?
Bowling from Columbine. Probably one
Yep.
of his better documentaries, in my opinion. Um, and I guess like this does kind of tie into based on what you're saying in the media and what we kind of said about gun control. Like here's the thing, the founding fathers couldn't have really predicted what society would look like in 2023. And it's just like this is
No
the
one
problem.
can.
We have kind of this
Yeah,
like
yeah.
literalist following of the ideas of the founding fathers, and some of those ideas were good ideas, but just like we can't really like look back at stuff that was thought up upon back in the 1700s and like perfectly apply it to present day society. Like we can't do that. And
No,
we
I agree.
and we do have to kind of evolve like as a society to go past that a little bit.
And I think the founding fathers were well aware that they could not see into the future as well. And when they are building their country, of course, they're building this country out of a number of compromises. no one got their way 100% when they were writing the Constitution.
No, not at all.
And so a lot of those compromises still exist today as echoes of when the country was founded. The Electoral College was one of them, right? I mean, that was a compromise in itself between the legislation picking the president and the people picking the president. How do you compromise between those two? They went with the states having a college to pick the president. And that still exists today. And so there are ways, of course, to alter, and the Constitution has ways to alter it. They just require a crazy amount of political momentum in order to carry out. To add an amendment to the federal Constitution takes, 2/3 of the states and a convention to ratify it? Is that right? Or an astronomical majority in Congress to ratify it? There's a few different ways you can add an amendment. But my point being, they require a lot of momentum and some congruence in multiple different interests in order to make those amendments. And if you maintain a divided, a polarized environment within your country, you're not going to see any of those changes happen. So if you have that polarization, you're going to get stuck with what you have already, which is kind of arguably what conservatives might be happy with. So if they can polarize, if they can split everything up, nothing will change. And for a lot of people, they don't want things to change because for whatever reason, they don't like whatever's being offered, or they might believe, like you said, a naturalist reading of American history where this is the way it ought to be because this is the way it was set up, for whatever reason. And I think that gives rise to a lot of the desire to polarize media, and why a lot of conservative people hung around when Trump went, nanners, and when Trump started polarizing. Because in a polarized environment, you're not going to get much done. And for a lot of people, they don't want to get too much done. They don't want to see too much get done.
Yeah, and I guess what I would add to that, the Constitution is supposed to be a living document, and I just don't really see why some people in America are so literalist with everything they believe.
The legislation, I think, or the legislative body being literalist is a little confusing, because you're a legislation. You should be able to write laws, right? That's your job. I can understand a judicial interpretation. So when a judiciary is looking at the document, a lot of them might very well reasonably argue that the law that's on the books, or the Constitution as it is written, they want to then look at what was being framed at the time that it was written. Because as a judiciary, you're not trying to play politics. You're trying to play what was said, and you're trying to reflect what was said exactly. So I can sort of understand that. And that's not necessarily, I'm not a judiciary, I'm not a lawyer, so there's probably a lot of ways to interpret it, but at least I can understand when a judiciary makes that claim as to why they're making that claim. From a legislative point of view, I don't really understand it, though. If you're writing laws, you should be able to write the laws that you want to write. Don't worry about what came before. You're writing laws. Write them within the scope of what you're allowed to write. So I do see your point.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways we could go about that, but I think that's pretty good for today. We're about at the 45 minutes in terms of in terms of what we've actually recorded. So,
yes, sir. I think we had a great show today. I hope you enjoyed listening. Sam, do you have any last comments?
Well, let's go Steelers. My Steelers are playing the Browns right now, and if we win and a couple other teams lose, my Pittsburgh Steelers might be going to the playoffs and then hopefully going to the Super Bowl. And, yeah, that probably won't happen.
Wow, that's crazy. Because they were having a rough patch at the beginning. But
we were 2-6 and we're 8-8, so we might win today and be 9-8, finish with a winning season, and we could be the 7th seed in the playoffs. And
there you go. How about that? 2023 looking pretty good.